If you're feeling stressed cause your life's a mess, don't overreact, just mind the gap. If you're feeling low, don't know where to go or how to act, just mind the gap. If you're struggling with all the problems in your life and nothing is ever turning out right, check your relationship, look out on how to act, and that's a fact, just mind the gap. Ooh.
So, thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to the Gap series. The Gap series is an initiative that Every Nation Rosebank, the Discipleship team, has put together to help formulate an idea of how to respond to the world around us. And we find that when we have faith, as we all do and proclaim as believers, we encounter certain gaps in our lives, So there's certain areas of mismatch that we encounter. And this is a series that's intended to address those. And we've identified three areas of gaps that we want to address through the conversations that we'll lay out for the next few days. And the first one is the obedience gap. You need to remember, God says that his thoughts are higher than our thoughts, his ways are higher than our ways. So already that establishes a sense of a gap between what he would like us to be and what he desires from us, and a gap between that and where we are. And so this is a series to try and help us move along and understand how to obey him, how to be, which is the formation gap, the second conversation in the series. And then we'll talk about the faith gap as well, which is really talking about how our identity in him impacts our activity and how our activities then impact the reality around us. And so I'm very, very, very excited this afternoon to welcome a very fascinating man. He is multifaceted, I think. I've had the privilege of knowing him for a while, but we'll get into his background, etc. And his name is Stuart Fisher. So I'd like to welcome Stuart Fisher to the show. Thank you, man. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's always good to be with you.
Awesome. So Stuart Fisher is an interesting man. He has a lot going on. He straddles many, many different worlds. I'm very fascinated, man, about your background, about how you came to be where you are in terms of your faith, but also in terms of the interests that you have, which are quite many, really. So in a nutshell, who is Stuart Fisher?
Jeez, it's a big nutshell.
It's a big nutshell.
And as you said, I've walked a journey so far. Having had life experience in basically more than one facet of life. So,
sure.
For instance, I grew up starting to play guitar when I was 6 years old.
Wow.
So, I don't know if you actually knew that.
6. The guy was 6.
6 years old.
No wonder it shows. If you hear him play, his ridiculous.
Thank you. You too kind. But yes, I picked up a guitar when I was 6 years old.
Okay.
And my parents were pastors, and so I had always been involved in church life.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And I remember picking up the guitar for the first time at what we called cell groups back then. I think
the cell groups. That was a long time ago when they were called cell groups.
It was a long time ago, man. I think the term has evolved over the years to
so
home
connect
groups,
basically.
Connect groups
right.
now, as you say. But back then it was known as cell groups.
Yeah.
And I picked up a guitar the first time, and my uncle was actually a guitar player. My father as well. But my uncle was playing at that point in time. Picked up the guitar and remembered what he played and played back to him. And as a result, they all figured out that I had a talent.
Inclination for.
There we go.
There's something there.
And that was the start of, I think, my musical journey. And I came to know later that that started actually with my parents. My dad was in the choir. He was also a guitarist, as I said.
Okay.
My mum, at some point in time, joined the choir. But when I was in my mother's womb, my dad used to play guitar to me. So.
Oh wow! So he set you up.
He did.
Basically, you were rigged, bro,
That's
from before
correct,
birth. Wow. Okay.
So, so for me, it was guitar was just something that came
natural.
naturally.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But at the same time, where I had a natural inclination for that. My father had one of the first computers or personal computers that you could get. And back then, those were the IBMs. I'm kind of giving away my age, but back then, if you had 64 megabytes of RAM,
that's quite a bit.
Yeah, your computer was the best on the block.
Yeah.
But I also started getting involved with computer back then, and it was the days before Windows. So for you to get onto your computer, you'd have to type in a command. You would have to launch all the apps. That's correct. MS-DOS.
MS-DOS, the language is crazy.
And there I was, 8 years old, already typing in commands, running games. For those of you who remember the old IBM computers that came with Windows. Right. Windows 3.1 was the first one that came out that actually had a graphical interface. So, I mean, that was my exposure to computers. And the reason I'm kind of letting you into that window of my life is because there was both a musical talent that was blossoming, and as well as that there was this exposure to logical programming.
Yes, computer world.
That's it.
Right.
And
so you took that up further?
That's correct. And that was always present, in my journey. So there were three kind of spheres of my world that was developing. That was the spiritual sphere. Okay. There was the musical sphere, and then there was obviously this logical thought progression thing that came along with figuring out computers.
Now, sorry, just before we tell me more about computers, I'm keen to know when. So you grew up in church, basically. Yeah. When did the experience of salvation, as it were, come to you? When did you understand the word for yourself, and when did you? Yeah.
Good question. And I think I had my salvation experience when I was pretty young too, about 8 years old. Okay. You had being a church kid, being a PK, a pastor's kid. You grow up hearing the stories. The Bible stories. You hear the word.
All very familiar.
That's it.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I grew up in a household where every Saturday morning we would wake up listening to teachers like Kenneth Copeland, Kenneth Hagin, those guys. Back then, I don't think they were as evangelistic as they are now, or as I think I've come to grow a bit in where the prosperity gospel is at now. Right. But back then they were teaching some solid faith stuff. I don't know if you remember back then.
I do
Tim's
remember.
Story
actually,
was around.
Yeah, I absolutely remember. That was a foundational stuff. The fundamentals were really good. Yeah.
Correct. And I mean, we've journeyed in our faith. We figured out a couple of things since then. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But that was my life. I mean, I grew up knowing the scriptures better than I knew my schoolwork.
Wow.
And those always stayed in me. So there was that, and then understanding that for myself at about 8 years old. I had this experience where I knew that I wanted to make a decision to follow Jesus. And I said that to my mom. I said, Mom, I want to make a decision for myself. Right. And she led me to the Lord. And I've never looked back since then. And it was a radical decision.
Well, at any rate, radical for an 8-year-old. That's pretty. For sure. It would have settled. You'd have understood it and running.
I grasped what it was. I grasped what it meant already.
The love of God and all that.
It. And I knew that this is what I knew. I wanted to dedicate my life to God.
Brilliant.
But I mean, in the
so fast forward. Sorry, Stu. Fast forward. You had these worlds intersecting. Yeah. You worked in IT. I presume you took it up.
Yeah.
Okay.
So firstly I wanted to study music because I had this musical talent, and a strange thing happened when I finished matric. I applied to UCT to study music. And it was actually my folks who said to me, well, do you want to take a gap year and just think about it? I think back then, going into a musical career in South Africa was always going to be a challenge.
Yeah, it'd be tough,
Yeah, and so it wasn't what it is now. I think the music industry now is way more advanced than it was back then. so they talked me down from going into studying music full time, and that was
Okay.
difficult for me. Yeah.
Okay.
But the good thing that developed out of that was, even at that age, I think I made this decision. I said to God, and we're talking about obedience,
Right.
where I had to sit and say, well, I need to be obedient to my parents, because they are the authority that God has placed the authority over my life. And in making that decision, God worked out a bunch of things for me. So
Okay.
I said to them, well, what would be okay? Can I take a gap year? They said, yes. What would you do in your gap year? And when I spent time in my quiet time, as an 18-year-old kid back then, I said, God, I want to actually give you the first years of my independence. So
I like that, like a tithe.
That's it, exactly.
The tithe. Okay, all right.
And part of that was a negotiation with my parents. I said, well, what if I give you 1 year? I'll go to Bible school, and then I'll see from there. And it was part of my obedience to God. I basically said to God, take my first years of my independence, and then I'll figure it out from there. Landed up in Bible school, and attended Rhema Bible School back then. The first year of Rhema Bible School, they piloted a new type of course, which is called Creative Ministry, which catered for musicians and worship leaders who wanted to go into ministry.
Into
the very
ministry,
first year I got there,
alright, like a bridge.
That's it.
All right, cool.
And in that year, I obviously came in there talented, joined the youth band, and met all of the professional musicians who pulled me into the professional industry a couple of years later. So it was that first act of obedience to my parents, to say, well, I'm going to honor my parents, that actually opened the door for my talent, my musical talent to grow.
That is, I love that. That's really instructive, because I think for a lot of young people as well who will try and figure out a few things, honor thine father and thine mother is an instruction that the scriptures talk about, and in your case, doing that and being and stalling on your own, meant that God had a blessing in that for you.
Absolutely.
And how do you think that I mean, what happened to you after that? And what was
great
the rest
question.
of the...
because we still have all these other spheres in play, the spiritual,
the spiritual
sphere, the musical sphere, which was now growing and expanding, and then obviously the theological part of Stu.
Yes.
That was developing. And in my first or second year of Bible school, I decided to do one more year, starting to figure out my calling and my gifting, and again tied to obedience. And we're going to chat about this in a second. But obedience operates a lot of times. Obedience operates where you can't determine the end point, where you need to obey without knowing where the end is sure. That's why obedience is so. It
is a journey into the unknown in many respects. Okay.
Yeah, we'll chat about that in a second. But in that second year, I needed to support myself for a while with funds running up from my parents. I needed to, obviously I'm in Joburg. I'm from Cape Town, by the way. So, and then I started up a job, and that landed up being IT service desk. And at Nedbank, I started as just a part-time person, and then it became a full-time job. And so then this IT career grew, and to be honest with you, I think that when the Bible says that do everything as unto the Lord, and when I had that attitude, God just blessed the work of my hands, and I saw that people recognized that I did things well. And invested in me coming on to permanent employment at Nedbank, and then this whole IT career started. Now, you've heard about left brain and right brain people. Right brain people are creative, and left brain people are logical.
A bit more,
So here you have Stu with not just one talent, but starting to grow in two. You might even say opposite areas. IT is very logical, and music is very creative
and all that.
Lots of times when you are trying to figure out your purpose, having a few things that you're good at is better than having lots of things that you're good at.
Right. Right.
Because then it becomes difficult to
Difficult
decide.
to kind of, yeah.
Does it make sense?
Absolutely. So, and this is the rub for me,
Yeah.
right? Like, when you have all these things that are bursting in you that, you identify, how do you tie that to the greater idea of obedience? At which point and how do you know that God is saying do this at this point in time, and then pick something up later?
Yeah.
I mean, there's that, the tension points and how's it been for you? Like how have you reconciled those tension points? Because that gap exists all the time.
Correct.
God is
100%.
asking you there, and you're here, and you're going, how do we bridge that? Right?
Yeah. So I mean, the reason why this is such a good question in terms of obedience is because you many times in your life you want things to be black and white so that decisions are easy, but life doesn't happen like that. Life is very much a series of seasons of where your giftings and talents start growing in certain directions, and whereas obedience becomes part of this journey, you don't know where you're going to, and so to trust God's voice becomes absolutely paramount. And so we would love it if God gave us a word, or we catch it. God said to you, right, catch, here's what you're going to be an accountant. Great. You know what I mean? I always think in terms of movies, because part of this thing is I'm a youth pastor, so I think youth in movies sometimes, and I think about like Harry Potter, where they choose what what group you're gonna be in. So put this little hat on you. Oh, that's where you are. You know what I mean? Go for it. But as you know, life doesn't happen like that, and so hearing God's voice becomes very important. Because I think that what God does with us is, as we become obedient, the next part of the plan becomes more clear. Becomes
more evident.
And that's how obedience starts to become a vital part of understanding your skills, your time, your talents. And understanding also that God might develop a skill in order to develop something else later on.
Right.
So
that's part of that whole, like, the great setup.
Yeah.
Where he is essentially working on you now here.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is really interesting, because if you look at, some of the characters in scripture, like David, who had to face a Goliath at some point, but he was prepared, running up against lions and bears and all that, and rescuing his
100%.
sheep from attacks, etc.
Yes,
so there's always like a setup for something else.
Absolutely. And David's a great example. Started out as a musician, became a king.
Yeah, there we go.
You know what I mean? And the one...
He straddled worlds too, man.
There we go.
A poet,
100%.
king, musician.
Right. I mean, part of the job of a king is to be strategist in terms of armies and economies and those. So there we can see that one gifting led to another opening. But it was only if David could be obedient that he would be, the next part of the journey became
more evident.
And that's why obedience is so crucial in your life. Not in obeying because you want your own end to happen, but because you obey because God said you must. And as we were talking about, obedience becomes is not a tool; it is a skill. So you have the opportunity to obey. In David's life, if he wasn't a musician, would he have found himself in the courts of Solomon playing to him? Would he have been in that company? We have to ask that question. And if he wasn't in that company, would he have then... And he didn't have the skill of, with the slingshot that he had developed.
Right.
Would he have then taken the opportunity to defeat Goliath? You know what I mean?
And so it's a series of obedient steps.
That's it.
That run together to formulate the story of our lives.
That's right.
Essentially, and we know that the tension points are, what do I stand to lose? Because often we think, what do I stand to lose in this situation? Obeying God versus doing that.
Yeah.
Obeying God versus this is a more convenient way of getting over this.
Yeah.
But just to appreciate that God has put it in such a way that as we grow the muscle of obedience, we begin to impact the activities that we do.
That's right.
Because our identity in God begins to determine what we do in the world and the level of obedience we we show in the world, and also how we impact culture, etc., etc.
You know, there's a great quote that I picked up along my journey, and somebody once said to me when I was trying to figure out what's the next step of obedience in my journey.
Right.
You know, do I go into music? Do I go into IT? Both of them are just as strong. You know, in fact, I think it was my dad who said to me, you know, do what you know till you know what to do. And I think that's just such a profound thing to say, because, yeah, that's what obedience is about. Do what you know the Father has told you to do, and then you'll know what to do, you know.
All right, so Stu, you said something really, really interesting about like obedience is a skill and not
A tool.
a tool.
Yeah.
Could you just elaborate?
Yeah, absolutely. I think most people think that when you practice obedience, you've got it, and that's it. You know what I mean? Or when you're obedient, that's an event. And the utility of obedience is that you might encounter a situation that asks you to be obedient. You might be obedient in that situation, and it might bring you a result. And you might encounter the same set of circumstances that ask you to be obedient, and it might be even more difficult to be obedient, or harder, you know, even more difficult to be obedient, or it might even be different like factors involved that challenge your obedience consistently. That's why for us to think of obedience as a tool is really the wrong way to think about it. You have to think about it as a skill, something that you consistently do, and that consistently become better at every time you're challenged with a situation. And you brought up David. David had to confront the fact that had he gone to Goliath, he could only do what he could do. The outcome of whether Goliath fell or not was not up to him. It was totally up to God. That makes obedience just as difficult every time you encounter
every single
situation.
time the need to obey comes along, it's a fresh opportunity.
That's right.
And
that's why obedience has to be thought of as a skill, something you consistently do, and that you have to consistently. It's like any type of skill. You might hit a 3-point shot from outside the three-point line once, twice, but the third time you would miss, even though and it's the same as like we were saying, you know, at another time you and I were chatting. If you don't consistently work at it, that skill can get
diminished.
That's right. And if you consistently do it, it gets better and better. But because you think of obedience as a skill, you need to understand that every opportunity to obey is just as hard as the previous one. And all you're doing is teaching yourself to respond the correct way. It's like muscle memory, exactly like building any other skill. You have to give yourself...
I love that. And I think it's the idea there is also that there is a fresh opportunity to depend on God.
Yeah.
Because God helps us to obey him by his Spirit.
And
right?
it ties into what we're talking about. You don't know what the next part of the journey is. And therefore, obedience is always difficult. So it's always the opportunity to trust, because you don't know. If you did know, you wouldn't need trust.
I wish we had more time. I really, really wish we had more time, because I think what you've hit on now is probably the best place to sort of wrap this thing up, and would encourage you to think through as you know, you interact with the series, just to think through of the different areas where there are gaps, and in this case the obedience gap, and how that impacts the rest of your life. So God has set it up in such a way that obedience in one area develops the muscle to obey God in other areas, and then you see the golden thread of God's plan for your life unfold in that way. So I really, really wish we had more time, but
Sure.
We're so grateful to have. We might have to do a part two. Hint, hint. But it's so good to have you on the program, man, and God bless you. This man plays for We Will Worship. He plays he's the electric guitarist for We Will Worship, and he's an incredible musician. Thank you for giving us a peek into your world and into your faith. God bless you, man.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
Amen.
Be blessed.
So what we really pick up from what Stuart, the conversation I had with Stuart a moment ago, is that he reflects that obedience is a skill. And that's really, really interesting. I've never quite seen it that way, but obedience is a skill, which means it can diminish or it can grow. And the more you practice obedience as a skill, you polish it and it grows. And also that obedience is tied to very often an area of unpredictability. It wouldn't be obedience necessarily if it was predictable. So because you don't know the outcome, obedience implies trust and surrender. You have to trust and surrender to God in obedience, knowing that even though you can't predict the outcome, God has got your back. Risk-taking is part of obedience. It's implied in the very idea of obedience, especially to God, who does not always show us the full journey, but shows us only bits of it. So we have to trust him enough. We have to take the risk. We have to, in a sense, take the dive and believe he'll catch us, and that he will fulfill our journey of obedience and our faith. He will reward it as we obey him.
If you're feeling stressed cause your life's a mess, don't overreact, just mind the gap. If you're feeling low, don't know where to go or how to act, just mind the gap. If you're struggling with all the problems in your life and nothing is ever turning out right, check your relationship, look out on how to act, and that's a fact, just mind the gap. Ooh.